All right. Well, welcome back, and let me turn the lights off so y'all can see this stuff a little bit better. Like I said, the video that I put up is pretty raw. It's not going to be anything pretty, but maybe it'll serve its purpose. And in about a year from now, we'll be on April 15th, actually. Oh, that's another thing. In this room, I'm running a VGA cable, all right, and it's going through a dongle. And my computer and the VGA don't like each other, so every now and then they take a break from one another. And it's kind of like a bad marriage where they take vacations apart, and so they do that. And after about 3 seconds, everything's cool. They come back for a little bit. So anyway, the idea here is to look at population. And about a year from now, on April 15th, we'll be doing the 2020 census. And so what we have here is the latest figures from 2010. I understand that's not really new stuff, but anyway, we need to, before we begin even talking about sovereignty and various facets of Indian country, we should probably at least start looking at some population patterns. And last time on the board, I said, okay, most of the American Indian population in the United States is located in the western half of the United States, west of the Mississippi River, right? So here we're going to look at some patterns that we have in the census. And I've got some questions in here, so I'll try to answer those for you a little bit. But there's this term known as self-identification. In the census, most of the information that the census collects is not verified in any way. It's all self-identification, like ancestry, for example. People identify with different ancestral groups depending on what they understand is their ancestry. Whether or not that's accurate is not really so well known. In the case of American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, the census is picking up, for the most part today, people who are self-identifying as American Indian or Alaskan Native. Okay, so recently, though, they also were allowed to report tribal affiliation. So tribal affiliation is one thing that's new to the census, and it'll be interesting to see how things have changed between 2010 and 2020 with tribal affiliation. The other thing I wanted to mention is that today is the birthday of the Center for Sovereign Nations, and I may get us out of here in just like an hour, because that way you all would have enough time to get over there. And I don't know if they'll have the buffet set up yet, but certainly students in this class are particularly welcome to go over and hang out under the big tent in front of Life Sciences East, and they probably will have hamburgers. That's my guess. Right? Maybe hot dogs and hamburgers. But I didn't bring my lunch today. I'm dependent on that. Okay? So, but you're certainly welcome. If you had a 12:30 class, you might have time to eat. So anyway, but they're definitely, they would like as many people to come by and hear what they would have to announce as possible. So I encourage you to go over there. If you know where Life Sciences East is, between Life Sciences West and Life Sciences East, so that's where we're going to be. All right, well, anyway, this idea of self-identification includes both American Indian groups and South American Indian groups. All right, so that's kind of strange. In other words, there are a lot of people who might have ancestry in Mexico who consider themselves Maya, for example, who are going to be counted as Indians in the United States. So it's not necessarily federally recognized Indian tribes, or it's not just North American Indian tribes. And in terms of the way the census collects things, the census recognizes American Indian or Alaska Native. That's the latest iteration of this class. This is the latest iteration, and it's always classified under race rather than ancestry. And that's an important caveat because in the United States Census, at least in recent censuses, there's a distinction made between ancestry and race. So you can be of, and it's self-identified, so you can count whatever you want, race or race or ancestry and essentially ethnicity. Now, Hispanic falls under ethnicity and ancestry, okay? Which is because, of course, Hispanic is a totally broad catch-all term that transcends any sort of racial category. Generally associated with linguistics, right? So it's an odd, the census is clumsy. The census has always been clumsy. So, anyway, and when did the census start counting American Indians? Well, there are other sources of American Indian population numbers. You can find books on American Indian populations. What are some of the sources for American Indian populations? Have the non-Indian populations been interested in the Indian population for very long? Somebody can answer that for me? No. Not really? I don't know. I might disagree with that. Let's think back. Okay. 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Let's see. 1819. 1819. That's the year. Isn't that the year that the United States took over Florida? Right? Remember that? It's 200 years ago. And you remember which military commander was kind of the leader of the invasion of Florida? Andrew Jackson, yeah, Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, initially, had some incursions into northern Florida. Why? Do you recall from your American history, just by chance, why Jackson was? What was his excuse for invading Florida back in the 18 teens? Of course, this is after the French and Indian. After the War of 1812, right? War of 1812, New Orleans is defended. Jackson is a war hero in 1814, New Orleans, Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans was serious business, actually. Pretty amazing that Jackson did that. But with all that clout, what was the excuse that Jackson used to invade Spanish Florida? The excuse was that in Georgia, slaves were running away across the boundary into Spanish Florida. In fact, there were entire communities of runaway slaves in northern Florida that, in one case, in the invasion of Florida, it was documented that there was this huge explosion that was leveled at this community, killed dozens of people. Anyway, that's kind of another story. But the native peoples of northern Florida, the Seminoles and the Muskogean groups and the Creeks who lived in North Florida, provided some degree of refuge for these runaway slaves. And they intermarried, and they had families together. And the Seminoles and the lower Creeks in this area of southern Georgia and North Florida were considered to be kind of the enemy of these plantation owners in Georgia, and the Carolinas. So the native peoples had something to do with that. Okay, so it's kind of interesting in that regard that the population numbers. I'm trying to get at why would the United States become interested in the population? Well, if we go back 1819. That's also the year that information is coming back from the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? Of course, that's over with by now. They got started in 1803, right? But the Lewis and Clark expedition itself, which got started as soon as Jefferson could get this group together, the Lewis and Clark expedition had the task of finding a route to the Pacific Northwest, to the Columbia River Valley. They weren't that successful at that. They did find the Columbia River Valley, but they had all these circuitous routes. But the other charge that Lewis and Clark had, in addition to charting out the Louisiana Purchase for the most part, was to provide a good count of the military strength of the native peoples in the Great Plains, and particularly the Northern Plains. Really nothing was known in Anglo-America. So the Lewis and Clark expedition sought to understand numbers. Wherever the Lewis and Clark expedition would land and meet a new group of Indians, as they were going up the Missouri River, that's basically their first part of their route. As they were going up the Missouri River, they would encounter these villages, Mandan, Dotsas, etc. And the first thing they wanted to know was how many warriors do you have? Okay, and also they wanted to establish some trade relationships. They were doing diplomacy, of course, but they did want to know about numbers. In fact, if you go back to the colonial era, before the United States even exists, in the days of the late 1600s, early 1700s, early explorers were often establishing numbers. They were counting population as much as they possibly could. This was something that the colonial governors wanted to know. It was basically information. It was military intelligence in a sense. So military intelligence has always been interested in the number of American Indians, right? But again, you can find all sorts of interesting studies on American Indian population, and there are some generalities about American Indian population over the centuries that we'll talk about. The first census to recognize American Indians as a racial group. Anybody want to guess?
From the first census.
Well, when was the first census? 1790. Census is established by the Constitution. We've got to have the census so that we can have apportionment and reapportionment. So the census process is every 10 years. It starts in 1790. However, if you look at the Constitution, and we'll look at the Constitution, I should have my paper Constitution. I usually have my phone Constitution, but today I realize I can't use it. Okay, but if you look at the United States Constitution, are American Indians mentioned at all? Are American Indians mentioned at all in the United States Constitution?
Treaties are.
Huh?
Treaties are.
I'm sorry, I have these things on, and it makes it hard for me to hear.
Treaties are.
Treaties are?
I cannot remember if Native Americans are specifically.
Well, they don't call them Native Americans.
Well, whatever.
So Indians aren't recognized in the Constitution at all? So you should read your Constitution closer, because Indians are mentioned 3 times. Okay? And they're referred to not as Native Americans, but as Indians not taxed. Indians not taxed. Has a great amount of significance to it. Right? So anyway, they are not counted as a group by the census until 1860. Right? 1860. And still, they're kind of an anachronistic group of people in 1860 because those Native Americans aren't Americans. They're not American citizens. They are aliens. Okay? I'm talking about in a legal sense. Okay? So, when did the census, United States Census, begin counting American Indians nationwide? Any guesses? 1890. Okay. So 1890 is always a significant year for the census. It was the year that the census declared the United States frontier closed. The frontier was no longer in existence because of population density at a certain level. It was just kind of a political thing. Anyway, when did the United States Census begin counting Alaska natives? I think, okay, well, Alaska was made a state, what, in 1958, 59? Actually, it was 1940. The census started counting because Alaska was a territory. So, but the United States Census started counting and differentiating Alaska natives. What were they before that? They were just considered American Indians. And this would include Eskimos, Inuits, who don't consider themselves to be American Indians at all today. Today the distinction is in the census American Indian or Alaska Native, and Alaska Native implies several things. You can be a member of an American Indian tribe living in Alaska, or actually native village, if they want to call them that. You can be an Aleutian Islander or an Aleut, that's a separate category, and Inuit, okay, Eskimo. So all three of those folks are considered Alaska Natives. And then American Indians are all other native peoples of the conterminous United States. Now, I say conterminous because I'm talking about the lower 48 plus Alaska, not Hawaii. Right? There are indigenous peoples in Hawaii, right? And Native Hawaiians. In fact, there is a Native Hawaiian national movement that's been going on for decades in Hawaii. However, Native Hawaiians are nowhere close to the same political status as an indigenous group, or as indigenous groups, as American Indians are. American Indians and Alaska Natives. Now, there's some distinction between Alaska Natives and American Indians that we'll see, and that distinction has to do with geography. It has to do with land. It's almost entirely a geographic distinction. And you can decide whether or not you think it was a fair shake, all right? But that's a long way into the course from here. No need to get there now. So the census then has these categories of native peoples. It has voluntary stuff like, your tribal affiliation too. Those are largely like ancestry and so forth. Now, if you look at the population pyramid, and this is sometimes referred to as an age-sex pyramid or a population pyramid. Hopefully, you've seen these before in other classes. The population pyramid is basically a graph of age cohorts of men on the left and females on the right, and men on the right and females. And these are age cohorts, okay? So you have the octogenarians up here, the people in the 80s, and you have the toddlers and the babies down here under 5 years old. If you look at this graph, and then this x-axis is sort of a dual axis, so it goes 0 to 8%, 0 to 8%, and each one of those cohorts is representing a certain percentage of the total population, okay? So this is an age, sex pyramid or population pyramid, and what it tells us is, it gives you an idea of, the age groups, sort of population growth rate, that sort of thing. And what would you see, I know a couple of you have had these before in my other class, what could you read about basically the shape of that population pyramid. What does it tell you?
There's a lot more young people than older people.
Okay, all right, so you've got a base that has you have a very broad base in this population pyramid, and that tells us that there's, well, generally it would tell us that there's a rapid population growth, a very rapid, fast growth rate, which is perhaps true for American Indians in general. However, this is just a little funky, right? This is just a little too weird. This is particularly this is one age-sex pyramid for Shannon County, South Dakota. What particular significance does Shannon County, South Dakota have? Somebody look that one up for me. Shannon County, South Dakota. Is that around Brookings, South Dakota, or Sioux City, South Dakota? Can you name, how many cities in South Dakota can you name? What's significant about Shannon County? Is that the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation by chance? Okay. All right, so the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, one of the poorest parts of the United States, a third world country in the wealthiest country on the planet. Okay? And it has a very young population. It has one of the lowest life expectancies, especially among males in the United States. It is an area that is, look at this. What happens in Shannon County, South Dakota, when you hit about age 18, 19? You leave. You leave as fast as you can, right? So very, very strong out-migration of college-age cohorts. Not everybody stays away, but for sure you've got a major out-migration in this example. And also a really high age dependency ratio. Age dependency ratio is the proportion of people who are not of working age or who are beyond working age. Basically, people who have are dependent on the other parts of the population, their parents or whatever, or their children. In Shannon County, South Dakota, you got a lot of kids, all right? Lots and lots of kids. Not a lot of older people, all right? The elderly population is pretty low. All right, this is an awful slide, but it's from a census publication from the 2010 census. So this is just a few ways of looking at the numbers, and you can see here, I got to kind of back off to see this, but you have the 2000 and the 2010 census in comparison. And if we look at the total population of the United States, you can see in 2000 we were at 281 million. In 2010 we were at 309 million basically. Now if you look at increases over time, over here 2000 to 2010, got a 9.7% increase. 9.7, that's 27 million people. How in the world does that happen? That would be, I don't care how busy young people could be, that's impossible for a population to grow that rapidly through natural increase, even with lots of twins, okay? So that has to do with what's going on here is a lot of migration, right? You've got a lot of immigration coming. So big time immigration from 2000 to 2010, plus relatively flat population growth. Now compare that to the American Indian population. And which one should we look at here? There's the American Indian and Alaska Native alone, or in combination, American Indian, Alaska Native alone. This is not very many people. But if you look at the primary group, let's just say not American Indian and Alaska Native alone or in combination is 277 million. So that means that for the most part we're looking at, let's look at this top number right here. So about 4 million people in 2000, about 5.2 million in 2010. Population growth rate 1.5, 1.7. That's a little higher than the general population in terms of the natural increase. So let's see, what else can we see? That's just general population. So now of the total, the percentage of the total population, percentage of the total population, 1.5. So what can we say about the American Indian population during 2010 and 2000 and 2010? Getting mixed up. Is the population of the American Indians increasing?
Yes.
Just a little bit, okay? But you got to remember though, we added 27 million people to the population over that decade, and the American Indian population continues to increase slightly. So they have a fairly rapid growth rate, even given this massive immigration and growth rate overall. How does that compare with most people's attitudes about American Indian populations? If you were to ask the man on the street at Walmart, in the Walmart parking lot, right, hey, what do you suppose the American Indian population is in the United States? You think they have much of an idea? Probably not. But they might be able to tell you whether or not the population was increasing or decreasing. And for well over a century, well over probably 2 centuries, the line of thinking among non-Indians is that the Indian population is decreasing. The Indian population is declining. And in fact, that has been the case at times, but not since the 19th century, not since the very early part of the 20th century. The American Indian population has been growing. Now, the American Indian population has grown exceptionally rapidly since about 1960. Okay? Why is that? Well, we might get to it. All right, here's some more graphics on the distribution of American Indian and Alaska Native peoples between these times, and this just shows some regional distributions. American Indian and Alaska Native alone or in combination. We'll just stick with this. So you have in the northeastern part of the United States, this is the percentage of the total population of the American Indian population. But as I said the other day, the West is the big one, and then here's the South. Now, the South, what's going on there? I'm asking you to think like a bureaucrat now, sorry. Why does the South have so many Indians? Well, because the state of Oklahoma is considered by the census, its region is called West-South Central, so it lumps it in with the southern states. So if it weren't for Oklahoma, the American Indian population in the South would be pretty minuscule. It would be like the Northeast. The Midwest is counting the Dakotas and Nebraska, which has fairly significant American Indian population, Minnesota, Wisconsin. So those are pretty significant. The Northeast, in terms of total population, fairly significant in terms of numbers of people, but in proportion to the rest of the northeastern population, very, very small. Okay. So it's in the West and in Oklahoma, you can pretty much assume that the red bars are, for the most part, Oklahoma. And in the western states and the Midwest, where most of the American Indian populations are, and most significant in the West, in western states like New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and in the South, Oklahoma. Here's some maybe better graphics to do some comparisons. I mentioned on the very first day of class that California has, except for like one census decade, had, when Oklahoma surpassed California briefly, California has had the largest number of American Indian people self-identifying as American Indians, okay? California. So now a lot of the California Indians, a lot of the people here actually trace their ancestry back to Oklahoma and to the Dakotas because they are urban Indians, right? They are native peoples who are the descendants of people who migrated back in the largely 1950s. There was actually a government program that we'll learn about later called the Relocation Program, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs set up an infrastructure to try to get native peoples off the reservation, out of places like Shannon County, South Dakota, and move them to places like San Francisco or Los Angeles. Okay, and so some people went, stayed for a little while, and returned, but some people didn't. Some people stayed. In fact, probably the most well-known American Indian leader in modern times in Oklahoma would be who? Wilma Mankiller, right. Wilma Mankiller, the first woman principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. Wilma Mankiller grew up in San Francisco. Okay, she was kind of a flower child in the 60s, and but her parental connections were back, to Adair County, Cherokee County, Adair County area, and so she moved back, and but very much connected to to the Bay Area of San Francisco. It's really kind of her home turf. Anyway, so Oklahoma, California, of course, Arizona, and if we look at this top one here, you'll see the rankings here. Now, Texas is kind of interesting, isn't it? What do you suppose is going on here? Close to Arizona? Well, maybe close to New Mexico. Maybe close to New Mexico. But a lot of these people are, people who work in Dallas-Fort Worth area who have American Indian ancestry or who are legally American Indians, mostly from Oklahoma. All right. So, I mean, this is where our graduates wind up. In fact, this is where a lot of our college freshmen come from. Right. It's North Texas, north of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I mean, all you have to do is drive around the suburbs of Dallas-Fort Worth and see all those OU license plates everywhere, right? And a few OSUs. Trying to working on that, but for the most part, you've got a lot of Okies lining up in Texas for whatever reason. So, New York has an indigenous population that's pretty significant. So does Washington State. So. Anyway, and then you have all the other states, but certainly California, Oklahoma, Arizona. So this is, and for the most part, any way you slice it. So, all right, finally maps. Thank goodness. All right, now here are this is a map that is done by the census. It's a pretty decent map. Now, let me explain something, and I'll put this online for you. Okay, so you'll see this. And we're going to talk about everything you see pretty much on this map is going to be the material for the map quizzes. So we're going to have, I think it's around 11, I can't remember exactly, 11 or 12 map quizzes. And, one of those map quizzes is going to be Western New York. So you'll learn those reservation groups in Western New York, which, we'll learn about North Carolina for the most part. How about this? Has anybody ever done the Smoky Mountains? Okay, I used to live in Knoxville. Did you go through the Smokies? Okay, that's what everybody does. They just drive through it. It's the national park. It's the most visited national park in the United States, and everybody does the same thing. They get in their car and they drive through it. And they say they've been to the national park. So that's that. All right, they drive from Knoxville to Asheville, like that. Anyway, on the North Carolina side of this area is called the Qualla Boundary. This is the eastern band of the Cherokees. So if you have Cherokee heritage, the eastern band is that group that hid out in the woods and didn't ever leave. There aren't very many of them, but they're one of the most photographed and tourism-oriented American Indian groups in the United States. My wife, who is Cherokee, her grandmother spoke Cherokee and only spoke Cherokee until she went to the boarding school, and they whipped them and washed their mouth out with soap when they were caught speaking Cherokee. So she learned English. But my wife, who grew up in Northeast Oklahoma, and I dragged her to the University of Tennessee back in 1989 because I wanted to go to graduate school. So one of the first things we did is we did the Smokies. We drove through Smokies. I said, "Oh yeah, we got to go to the Cherokee Indian Reservation." I said, "What? Cherokee Indian Reservation? Are you kidding me?" So we get there and we drive through, and the first thing we see, a guy standing on the road with a big, and this is like headdress, just out of the movies, massive headdress, and the headdress was dyed like a blaze orange, just like a hunting vest or something, blaze orange, and people were stopping and taking photographs of this guy standing out there with a headdress on, and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This is awful. So anyway, that was a fun experience. But Native people live in different clusters. For example, this is the Mississippi Choctaw area. Again, it's connected to the Choctaw Nation. But and then you have groups like the Homa in Louisiana and the Chitimacha and different Caddoing groups up here in northwest Louisiana. Of course, this is the area that most people think of in the United States when they think of the American Indian reservations. They think of the Navajo Reservation. We can talk more about basically what you're looking at here on the lines. You'll notice here that, does anybody see, obviously you can see the counties, and we have like 3,000 and something counties in the United States. What are you looking at here in Oklahoma? How many reservations do we have in Oklahoma?
Depends on who you ask.
That's right. It does depend on who you ask. Explain what you mean by that.
U.S. government unilaterally deemed reservation to all the reservations that were in Oklahoma.
Except,
Oh no, it says it got rid of all of them.
yeah, just recently there was a ruling that says even the Osage Reservation is a diminished reservation. And so it's not diminished, it's completely gone. And it was completely gone a long time ago. Anyway, but what you're looking at here in Oklahoma, these brown lines are the historical boundaries of the various Indian nations or reservations. We make a distinction between the five civilized tribes who had a slightly different land title than the other reservations. Now in Oklahoma, those boundaries, those historical boundaries, have some political and therefore economic significance. They have political significance in that today they are referred to it by the census as Oklahoma Tribal Statistical Areas, or Oklahoma Tribal Jurisdictional Statistical Areas. Other areas of the United States, Oklahoma Tribal Statistical Areas, OTSAs, and other areas, other reservations, and other areas that are made up of trust land in one form or another are called different things. So sometimes it's a reservation, and that's clearly a jurisdictional boundary. Other times, the jurisdiction might just be referred to as a tribal jurisdictional statistical area, TJSA. I'll show you I'll put all this in writing for you. So, but in Oklahoma, it's a distinct. We have our own census category, the Oklahoma Tribal Statistical Area. All right. Now, I guess let me back up a little bit. And if we're looking at this map, you can see, okay, there's basically think of these as reservations or as some kind of political entity. You know, the Wind River Indian Reservation up here in Wyoming. A lot of smaller ones up in the north woods of Minnesota and Wisconsin. But those tribal jurisdictional areas don't always correspond entirely with the presence or the location of the American Indian population. Right? So, as you know, let's call that guy at Walmart the man at Walmart, the man on the street, the man at Walmart parking lot. If you were to ask him, where do most American Indian people live in the United States? Well, if he's, he may say, well, in the western part of the United States. Well, and you say, be more specific. What might they say? On the reservation. If they're not in Oklahoma, okay? Oklahomans are special in the sense that, we understand things a little differently for the most part. But if you're asked somebody like in, Ohio, they would probably say, the majority of American Indians live on reservations in the West, right? Is that accurate? Most American Indians do not live on reservations. And in fact, a lot of the population of American Indian reservations are non-Indian, okay? So this is a conundrum. This is what makes the geography of Indian country fun and interesting and cool and bizarre. All right. So anyway, we got these jurisdictional boundaries that are in some way relic boundaries of United States Indian policy, of the existence of reservations that don't necessarily exist anymore, or at least they exist in a different way. Okay. One of the things about growing up in Oklahoma is you will see people refer to the term reservation in a somewhat endearing way. And that kind of goes against American popular culture. Because the reservation is supposed to be if you ask your typical suburban Californian or New Yorker, they will tell you, because they've learned it in school, that the reservation is a prison. And it's the territorial representation of American genocide against the native peoples. Okay, and that's the line. In Oklahoma, you got people arguing, saying this is reservation land, this is our reservation, when in fact it hasn't existed on a map as a reservation in a century or so. What they're referring to is tribal trust land or trust land of some sort, federal Indian trust land. And to them, that is reservation land. And technically, to the United States government, it is reservation. It's what's called an informal reservation. So whenever somebody asks you about, are there any reservations in Oklahoma, you say, absolutely there are reservations in Oklahoma. There is a slew of federal Indian trust land all over the state, and it is a major job of geographic information management to know where it is. And it has very, very important connotations on how land is used. When I, early on in my career here at OSU, back in the late 90s, I was having a conversation with an agricultural economist who's still here, great fellow, agricultural economist who was from Maine, okay? So he grew up in like southern Maine and didn't know much about Oklahoma until he got to OSU. Like so many faculty, it's like they come from all over the place and they land here. They learn about the place. Anyway, John was, I was talking to him one day and he asked me about my interest, and I said, oh, I'm interested in federal Indian trust land. And he said, really? I said, yeah. He goes, I've been driving through rural Oklahoma so much, doing my ag economic stuff. He goes, I've noticed wherever there's Indian land, nobody farms that land. I said, well, yeah, I understand that. That's why I'm interested in it, okay? He said, they don't use that land the way they ought to. Why is that? And so we had a long conversation. But, I don't have the answers, but I have some clues and some hunches and some examples of why. So land is often neglected, and we'll talk about why. That's the purpose of the class. We'll talk about why that land is often very, very differently utilized because it has a trust status, because it has a restricted status. It's both a conundrum and it's an advantage in some ways. Okay? What's the advantage of living on trust land, living on let's say a restricted allotment? What's the advantage of that? Hunting. Okay. If you're an American Indian. Okay. Not if you're not. What else? Actually, we'll talk a lot about hunting in here. Okay. I got a whole unit on hunting and fishing rights. That's kind of one of my favorite things to talk about. Hunting and fishing. And so, and we'll talk about, those of you who have taken conservation of natural resources, this is largely a course about resources, natural resources in Indian country, because that's what matters. That's what is affected by jurisdictional forms. It's sort of conservation made more complex, and more fun, more interesting. So, what was the question? Oh, are there any advantages that you can think of trust land? My sister-in-law, for example. My sister-in-law is Cherokee, but she's married to a Yuchi guy, and they live over in Creek County, and they live on his family's allotment, 160-acre allotment, and that's where they will always live. Because why? It ain't gonna get sold, right? It's never gonna be sold. You can't sell it. You build a house on it, well, you're not gonna sell that house either, right? Everything you put into that house, and my sister-in-law has put tens of thousands of dollars into this house, right? My brother-in-law's house. They won't ever sell that. That capital is use capital. It's not investment capital in any sort of way, okay? Because that land and that home is owned not just by my brother-in-law, but by a few dozen of his family members, right? So that's one of the problems. You have this problem of property being divided among multiple heirs, multiple owners. And that's something we'll talk about extensively. So what are some advantages? That's kind of a disadvantage if you can't possibly sell your real estate, right? If you can't sell your real estate, you don't have much of an economic incentive to improve your real estate, right? So like, we just got a new backyard fence, right, around our house, because the fence that I've been working on for 20 years, and I'm a terrible fence fixer. And my wife finally just said, let's just pay somebody who knows what they're doing. So we got a new fence, and it's beautiful. I love it. But it cost about as much as a car, all right, or at least an old used car. And that was a big chunk of money, but man, I'm happy with it because it massively improves the value of my property. And so I think it's most definitely an investment that's going to perhaps pay off when I sell the house. But I can sell the house. That house is not on trust land. And that means I can have an incentive to improve it because I don't have any intent to ever move. I'd like to just stay there until I'm long gone. Stay there until they haul me off. But the house that I live in now, I love my neighborhood and I love the house. And lived there for 20 years, and we finally got to where we really want it. Kind of everything's fixed. And I don't have any incentive, any notion to sell it anytime soon. But when I die, And when my wife's gone, I hope we can get as much money as we possibly can for it, so my children can split it and fight over it. Okay. But anyway, that's how that goes. But in the case of my brother-in-law, Danny and Susan, they will never pass anything on to their heirs that has any greater value than what it is they have. So there's a major economic disincentive to improve property. That's one of the things that fascinates me about this whole issue. Okay, so trust land, tribal jurisdictional statistical areas, population locations. Okay, we got a lot of, for the most part, you can see 8% or more. What county in the state of Oklahoma? You can say this for the quiz. All right, what county in the state of Oklahoma has the highest proportion of American Indians? That is, the largest percentage of people in the county, American Indians. It was not going to be Tulsa, of course, or Oklahoma County, because those are the two major urban counties, right? So it's probably going to be a rural county. By the way, Osage County, which we were talking about earlier, often is noted as the only reservation in the state of Oklahoma until a recent court decision that recognized it as having been disestablished. That's the term, disestablished. Don't worry about that now. It's considered a metropolitan county because it's part of the Tulsa metropolitan area. So you can't find much more open space in Oklahoma unless you go to the Panhandle. Certainly in the eastern half of Oklahoma, and then Osage County. Okay, Osage County is just beautiful and broad and grazing country, but it's considered a metropolitan area, so part of a metropolitan area. So that kind of screws up some of the data. But if you look at the percentage of American Indian population in Oklahoma, this county right here, Adair County, I think I said that's where Will Mankiller's family is from. Adair County has a population of right about 48-49% of the total population who are members of federally recognized Indian tribes, mostly Cherokees or Kituas. So that's the largest population, or the most concentrated population of American Indians in Oklahoma. It's not as great a concentration as American Indians in the Navajo and the Hopi Reservation. By the way, those brown squiggly lines, which we're calling reservations or tribal jurisdictional areas or statistical areas, there's a pretty fascinating political geography when we get into this. This is the Navajo Nation, right? Navajo Indian Reservation. What is this?
Another nation.
Yes, so the Navajo Nation is like South Africa. It's perforated. It's a perforated region, and therefore this one is what? Hopi. Yeah, that's the Hopi Reservation, and the Hopi are basically an enclave within the Navajo Nation. Right? So that's one of those interesting geographic dynamics. All right, we'll zip past some of this stuff and look at some more maps. This is percent change in the American Indian population. What sort of pattern do you see here? Well, okay, 100% or more change. Well, a lot of this is probably going to be very, very small numbers, right? So people moving around where Indian populations are relatively small shifts in population. Kind of an interesting map, though. So, what kind of stands out? What might be some explanations for things like this? I mean, if you have 50 people in a county, and over 10 years you have 120 people who are classified as American Indians, then you're going to have a big major shift. So it's kind of I don't really see a lot of point in this map. same sort of thing there. Okay, good. Here we got some city data, and here we have the 10 places with the largest number of American Indians in 2010. Okay, and just large numbers. All right, so interesting. Here you have the what city has the largest number of American Indians? That'd be a great trick question, wouldn't it? Of course, New York City, 111,000 people. Then Los Angeles. But then we get into the regions where that actually matter. So Phoenix, 43,000. Oklahoma City, number 4. So you might want to keep that one in mind. Tulsa, number 6. Right. So Tulsa, Oklahoma City, with its fairly large populations, then Albuquerque, and then we have just other really big cities for the most part. Tucson, Tucson's an important one perhaps. But anyway, Oklahoma City and Tulsa, metropolitan areas, fairly large populations. Now, if you adjust this to population, what do you find? Well, things get even more interesting if you're from Oklahoma. Anchorage, Alaska is the city that has the largest percentage of American Indian people. Okay. And then you have Tulsa and Norman, Oklahoma City. Okay, kind of cool. Huh? So we have Oklahoma really standing out as urbanized and really suburbanized American Indian populations. A few other larger cities around the country stand out in Washington, Wisconsin, Arizona, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And the distribution of American Indians by status. So we have in those areas, this is the question about reservations, basically, right? So the blue areas are those areas that have some kind of tribal jurisdiction. And so you can see that when you're looking at American Indians and Alaska Native alone or in combination, or just American Indian, Alaska Native alone, 20 to 30% of those people living on reservations. But again, that's very much the minority. So, and this percentage is actually, this percentage is growing, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2020. More and more people leaving reservations or those areas that are jurisdictional areas. Total American Indian areas, Alaska Native village areas. Those are very numerous, but not really that big. And then outside of areas. So for the point here is that most of the American Indian population is not within reservation areas. So more ways of looking at the same sort of thing: reservations versus native village areas. Just some general. I'm going to ask you about the largest reservation in terms of numbers and that sort of thing. So obviously the Navajo Nation is the big one, and then you have some other reservations that have really fairly large populations. The Pine Ridge we talked about a little bit earlier. Ones around Phoenix, and then we have Osage County. Okay, a lot of those people are living in suburban Tulsa in Osage County. So large reservations. Most reservations have relatively small populations, and we don't even see them that well on the map. But here we have some tribal designations, some tribal groupings. And this is another very intriguing sort of pattern, because there are some tribes like the Cherokees where most of the tribal population, okay, is what? So the distribution of the largest American Indian tribal groupings by response type. So you have people who are Cherokee or lone, and then Cherokee and something else. Navajos, however, tend to be mostly Navajo. So you have perhaps a culture that is more or less endogamous, and where people don't tend to marry outside of that culture. On the other hand, most people who are referred to, or most people who consider themselves Cherokee, are also members of other tribal groups like creeks or Choctaw. And here's some other examples: Choctaw, Cherokee, Blackfeet up in Montana. Anyway, so that's another kind of interesting pattern to that. Okay? And it's about 11:30, so good. 11:30 is when I was shooting for. And like I said, if you head over there to Life Sciences East, the south lawn of Life Sciences East, there should be a large tent, and hopefully you'll be smelling some beef on a grill or something like that. And if you have time, head on over there. Okay? We'll go ahead and dismiss a little early today. Okay? So be looking for stuff online. I'll post a bunch of stuff for you. You'll have some reading. It's been kind of a light week, but it's gonna hit you here in a little bit. So enjoy the weekend, and next week we're gonna hit the ground running. So have a good rest of the week.
I was a late register. I
Okay.
registered on Tuesday.
All right.
Do you have the syllabus online or?
I don't. No, not yet. We had some issues with Canvas and that sort of thing, but I'm aiming to have it available, everything reorganized this afternoon. If not this afternoon, tomorrow by noon or something. But I'll let you know when everything's ready to go. Okay. And basically, I don't know if I put it on there. Yeah, I think I did. I did put some stuff in the syllabus. I did.
Okay.
Things like grading scales and what the points are generated from and that sort of thing. So
Okay.
you'll see a little bit, but not the whole syllabus. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Professor, did you take enroll?
No.
Okay.
I'm not.
I know you said you didn't do it a whole lot, but since I
Yeah.
got in late.
Yeah. No problem at all.
Okay. Thank you.